Alright, sorry about the lack of video yesterday. I was busy at work, as tends to happen, but darn it, let's get these reviews done. So let's go ahead and continue here, shall we? Final Fantasy III. Now, there's a lot of things I actually want to talk about with regards to FF3, and this is going to become more and more of a trend, by the way. So I hope you can forgive my indulgence. As the FFs go, it's going to do this thing actually. The amount of things I have to talk about is going to peak basically at about FF6, and then do a very slow decline, and then kind of go down a bit. So sorry. But FF3. Now, FF2 really began the FF series, as I mentioned before, because, so many of the precepts, so many of the basics began with FF2. That's where they started so many of the base concepts that they would use, the fundamentals that would guide them when they continue to make the series in the future. Final Fantasy III, nevertheless, was an important step for them. It was an important growth moment. It was a lot of firsts, and I'm not talking about little trivia things like, this was the first game with a Moogle, or this was the first game with a Chocobo. No, no, no. We're not talking about mascots here. We're talking about base core precepts, things that actually fundamentally change your game in a base level, in a foundation level. Final Fantasy III was another look at the limitations that they were faced with, because as I've mentioned before, in FF1, because they were working on the NES, because of the limitations of technology and time and resources and everything, they had only so much to work with. If you could picture it, a pie chart, basically. Here's our pie chart. Once we're 100% here, we're out. We're done. There's nothing else. So they decided to make a setting, a world, and explore a place you could explore. That while the story overall was there, it was a little more threadbare, and while it was actually fairly linear, it never actually felt that way. It gave you that feeling of exploration, of openness, and did so on purpose, for that matter. And so, Final Fantasy 1 went that route. Final Fantasy 2 shrunk the world, shrunk the expansiveness, made it a lot more on rails so they could tell more of a story, had a lot more characterization, had a lot more development of the individual people involved, and the actual plot and background and story and all that fun stuff. And then finally we reach Final Fantasy 3. Now, I want to take a quick aside. Every generation up to about the PS1, debatably the PS2, has had games that pushed the limits of what the hardware was capable of, what the software was capable of, for the matter. Really actually got to the edges of what the technology could handle. And Final Fantasy III, Final Fantasy VI, and Final Fantasy IX have been games that have been on, as most people refer to it, as the bleeding edge. Have been so far advanced that they could arguably have been developed for the next generation console, and probably done so very well. But what they did was they took the existing limitations and stretched them basically to the breaking point. I actually know a friend whose PlayStation 1 exploded, overheated, and caught on fire while he was playing FF9. And I could even tell you the scene. It's the scene where they're fighting the crystal dragon and it crystallizes. And what the hardware had to do was render every single fragment as an individual polygon with its own motion tracking in order to get the effect across. And the PlayStation 1, even my PlayStation 1, has trouble with that to this day, with that scene. It still chugs, and I know most people's do. And, there's several scenes like that in FF9 and in FF6. There were several problems with that. Well, I shouldn't say it like that, because there were no problems in FF6 or FF3. I'm sorry, I'm being disingenuous. My point I'm trying to get across here is that they have taken what they had and pushed it as far as it was basically capable of pushing. If they pushed any harder, they might have gone over the limit. In fact, it is arguable that FF9 did go over the limit because it did have some latency and difficulty issues with the hardware, but let's just move on. Point being, FF3 really pushed the boundaries of what the NES can do, and somehow had managed to eke out that they'd taken this pie chart and somehow managed to just expand it just a little bit, just basically to the breaking point here, but not actually to the breaking point, and crammed so much. FF3, FF1 was a long game, FF2 was a long game, FF3 was an enormous game, especially for the time. It's astonishing that a NES game can be as long as Final Fantasy III is, and the problem, of course, to bring this all full circle here, is what do they do with their existing resources? What do they fill out the pie chart with? Now, as usual, they had looked at this and they said, well, we could do the same thing and we could make that work, but let's try something different. And this is why I liked the old FF style back when Hironobu Sakaguchi, again, I apologize if I'm getting the name wrong, was still a major contributor, a major point in the Squaresoft company. They did actually do new things. They did actually try new things. They did actually approach things from a different angle. But one of the things that they were trying to do was to come up with a completely new combat system, a completely new mechanic, just like they did in FF2, right? And basically what they had come up with, and I'm not going to go into details here, was unfeasible with the hardware and the software and the time and the budget. And so what they did instead was they're like, okay, why don't we take something we've already done? Obviously, we've only done 2 games, but we'll take one of them and we'll expand upon it. Now, pardon me. There was a lot of popularity with the whole class system of Final Fantasy I, but one of the biggest complaints about it was if you wanted to try a different combination of classes, you had to start the game over, basically. You know what I mean? So they came up with what is now referred to as the job system. Now, I will go out, I will admit freely and say the job system is, if we're talking about systems of mechanics, of game mechanics in RPGs that aren't MMOs, the job system is arguably one of my favorites. It is often implemented well, and when it is implemented well, I enjoy it immensely. FF3 is probably one of the most minor examples, but then again, it is basically one of the first. Even calling FF1 an example of the job system is debatable at best, you know what I mean? If I had to pick, I'd probably say FF5, Final Fantasy Tactics, Dragon Quests, several, 6 and 9 both come to mind. Several games have used the job system to great extent, and so, props to FF3 for coming up with the system. But what they did, my point I'm trying to get to here, is rather than stick to the law, they stick to the letter of the law, they stick to the adherence of the law, rather than say we have to do something different like they do in more modern Final Fantasies, just to put it honestly. What they did was they said, why don't we take something we already have, the job system in FF1, and improve it? Why don't we make it more? Why don't we make it better? And it worked. It worked phenomenally. Granted, in FF3 there was only so much you can actually do with it. But in fact, there was basically nothing you could do with it. Later games like FF5 or Tactics or many of the others I listed will give you a long-term benefit even if you switch off the class. And for example, if you master Fighter, just to use a random example, you'll gain this benefit from the fighter, even if you switch over to a white mage, and so you can do the tool thing, blah, blah, blah. And of course, advanced classes and prestige classes, all that sort of thing gets into the mix, and it gets wonderfully complicated. Of course, I love complication, as usual. Good complication, of course, not bad complication. Yes, there's a difference. But the point I'm trying to get to here is FF3, though simple, because all FF3 does is let you switch classes, was very well done and a very good step in the good direction. Now, here's the problem. Implementing a job system with the ability to swap at will, basically, and all of the complications that were involved therewith, took up a lot of space, a lot of time, a lot of hardware, a lot of budget, and there was actually not much left. And there were a couple other things they did that were both innovative that I'll get into more in detail later. I'll get into one of them actually in just a moment here, but my point is, between this and the other things, they had very little time and space left in order to fill out everything else that would make up a game. So FF3, especially in direct comparison to, say, FF2, feels a lot more flimsy is the word I'm going to use here. FF3, despite several very good things going in its favor, the story is extremely hard to explain. And I don't mean it's complicated. What I mean is it's really hard to explain how it almost reads like a fanfic, a bad fanfic, and I hate to say that because it's kind of an insult, but it's the truth. The whole, you go here and some guy's like, oh my gosh, and you're like, goodness, we need to go to this town. And then you go to the next town and you'll see like a scene with a chunk of dialogue, and then go to the next town and then see a scene without a chunk of dialogue, and there's usually a dungeon in between. It was very... If you were to imagine... excuse me. This is a really weird analogy, so bear with me. If you were to imagine that a game story, I should say, is something that connects between different meals, okay? Bear with me here. Like the thing I just mentally pictured immediately was a bunch of string connecting, a few dinner plates with some nice meals on it, just lying out on a table or something, right? I know, this is a weird analogy. Bear with me. If Final Fantasy I would have had, instead of string, some kind of really strong rope, it was rather sturdy, and the meals themselves were pretty small because each meal is a point in the plot, and each one of them was actually more like a little side dish, an appetizer, something like that, and they all connected, and then there was like one full course at the end. Final Fantasy II, the string, and I do mean string, we're talking about like twine here, connecting them, was barely there. It was still there. It was still acceptable, but the meals were much nicer, much more proportioned. There was actual full course meals going on here. Final Fantasy III feels like there's wooden planks connecting them. A step up here from the rope. This is actually really well constructed intermittent points, because the rope in this case, the connector, is the gameplay and the mechanics and the graphics and the music, everything else that makes up the game, connecting the story to itself. But each story point was like a piece of fruit. Not even the appetizers of FF1. It was just like there's an apple, and then there's a strawberry, and over here is a peach. It was the strangest thing, and I remember being so confused playing that game when it first came out, because I was just like, what? Where am I going? Why am I going here? And you could tell, it was very obvious, you could tell that they simply ran out of capacity in terms of budget, in terms of time, in terms of space, in terms of hardware, in terms of software. In all manners, they simply ran out. They ran dry. And so you could tell at each point it starts to ramp up as though it's going to be this scene, and then it basically just drops dead. It's like literally, and then, okay, go to the next town. Next town. You know what I mean? Now, this is technically a complaint, I guess I should say, but it's not so much complaining. I'm not trying to say, oh, this game sucks. Goodness, no. FF3 is higher up than the previous two I just mentioned. But this is probably the single weakest point of the game. The story is very threadbare, very hardly there at all, and most of it doesn't even advance until you get to the point where you actually ascend the Crystal Tower, which is a problem several of the older RPGs tended to have in general. Now, before I get into the story in depth, because there are some things I want to talk about there's something else I want to mention with regards to this whole space issue. One of the things FF3 we have to thank for is the concept of a multiple overworld. Now, this is a strange thing to think about, because most people nowadays, people from more modern eras of gaming, don't realize that connecting stages, connecting areas was actually a problem, an engineering problem, if I could put it in such a term, that programmers had to overcome. Some people did, say, the Mario 1 route, which is just the stages connect. There is no Some people did the Mario 3 thing. Some people did the drop-down selection menu. And some people did the overworld thing. Now, the overworld thing was generally preferred, but it took up the most space and overall difficulty in order to produce. I want to stress this point to really get the point across here, because what I'm talking about in FF3, what they did was they had multiple overworlds. Only two, actually, I guess they had three. I'm sorry, they had three overworlds in Final Fantasy 3. There was the floating continent. There was the overworld. Technically, there was also the overworld covered with fog, which does deserve some mention because that was a coding problem they had to overcome. And then there's the under the water section. All of this had to be done, and they wanted to do this. They wanted to have more than one overworld. It was something they had been wanting since FF1, actually. But overcoming that obstacle, overcoming that programming problem, that engineering difficulty, was something that took them several years in order to bypass. And when they finally pulled it off, it was like, oh my god, I don't even know how to properly explain this. I really don't, because having the different layers thing, let's just not go into it. I find it fascinating from a coding perspective, and I admit it. It was a huge difficulty, and the fact that they finally pulled that off was awesome, and it's no surprise that they didn't just do it once, because they were originally just going to have the floating continent. They then added the underwater sections because, by God, they wanted to play with this new toy that they'd invented, and I don't blame them in the slightest, to be honest with you. I would have done the same thing. So props to that, but that is another contributing factor. Having multiple overworlds really put a drain on time, resources, budget, etc. Space, and was another reason FF3 had to be squished in other areas. Now, as I was talking about the story, with FF2 and onwards, at the very least until a certain point, the concept of a theme, of each FF having a theme, was something that was very much a strong point with the creators, with the developers. They wanted there to be some overarching arc, actually, to that story. They wanted it to mean something. And I already mentioned in Final Fantasy II, it was really about freedom versus oppression, or if you prefer, law versus chaos. It can be debated in several different ways. Let's just move on. In FF3, they made a couple other first steps. I'll talk about those more in detail when I get to the individual that it's specifically referencing, but the theme they went with was light versus darkness. Now, This was interesting because it would be very easy to make light versus darkness a story of just good versus evil. But they didn't. While obviously dark and several of the dark things involved in this game are the enemies at this point in time, it's not actually their fault, if you know what I mean. It's it's a very yin yang thing, to put it simply. It is portrayed that the dark is not evil any more than the light is evil. All that's happening is the balance between the two has been upset. And in fact, but this, at the game before the game started, so it's referenced several times that I'm sorry, I'm actually doing this the wrong way. The light had completely overwhelmed the dark, and there were actually I love this. There were actually dark warriors, just like the light warriors. There were dark warriors who were chosen by the dark crystals in order to defeat the light, in order to bring balance back. And now it's the opposite. Now we have darkness flooding the land, and the light warriors are showing up in order to defeat the dark, and blah blah blah. But I really liked that they made it a point and actually emphasized it multiple times with the very little text and resources they had. They still managed to get that point across strongly, that this is not about good versus evil. This is just about balance. And I liked that. I liked the fact that that was one of the strongest, actually, themes about Final Fantasy III was balance, and the fact that there needs to be a cohesion between the two rather than simply one side dominating the other, like, say, George Lucas would have you think. Not going to get into that. But I really enjoyed that theme, and I really enjoyed the way it played out. And I'll go ahead and mention this here. Actually, no, I won't. That gets to wait. I fling it aside. But the other theme, there was one other theme. This is also one of the first FFs, to my knowledge anyways. I guess this is the first FF to actually have multiple themes going through it. And that would be the theme of... How do I even put this? The theme of the little people, okay? The theme of triumph in the face of inconsequentiality, in the face of unlikelihood. This is not about, I want to stress how I'm putting this, because the kind of story where unlikely people rise up and become heroes is, even at this point, even when FF3 came out, was already becoming rather common. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is in FF3, the little people, the guys who weren't heroes, the guys who were not amazing, the guys who did not have the power of whatever, the crystals in this case, still had an impact, still mattered, still were relevant, and still had a direct point on the plot, on the progression of the story and the way things worked. Nowhere is this more potent than the Trap of the Five Dragons, or whatever it's called, within the Crystal Tower, where Doga, I believe his name is, teleports around the worlds, and I guess it is just one world ultimately, and picks up several individuals to come and help save them from it. And several of the individuals are obvious, the princess and the engineer whose name escapes me, and Sid. Yeah, separate people there. But he also picks up one of the random, the four men of awesome, the old balding guys who were pretending to be heroes and weren't. He picks up one of them, and he picks up the prince, who was a prince, yes, but he was also a kid who knew nothing, who did nothing, who was a weakling. And the princess, while we're on the subject, forgive me for saying this, but was not exactly a powerhouse of any kind either, in any way, shape, or form. And so forth and so on. You get my point. These were all just people, ordinary people with their own little specialties and their own little worlds, who nevertheless were crucially important to the plot. And that sort of thing, that was the strongest moment of what I'm talking about. But that was something pervasive throughout the whole game, throughout the whole plot. That's the secondary theme underlying there. And I also enjoyed that theme a great deal, I might add, because it showed that even though you have because that theme is also emphasized by the other thing, which I'll get into in just a second, with the kids. But even on top of that, even the people who don't get imbued by the crystals, even by the people who don't have, the ability to change classes and have all this power at their disposal in order to go forth and brave the horrors and the enemies and the monsters and try and save the world. Even the people who aren't going through all of that hell, nevertheless have a point, have a say, have a place in this world, in this setting. And I like that message, I like that theme that really pervaded throughout the game. Now, I mentioned I was going to go into this next. I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. The children thing. In every fantasy work, one of the things you have to do is you have to create a balance between antagonist and protagonist. And, oh, please tell me that's not the phone, which I don't even have on me. Sorry about that. I'm going to hope that was a quick enough interruption that I don't have to edit that out because editing takes so long on this poor little laptop. Alright, where the hell was I? When you're making a fantasy story, I'm sorry if I'm reiterating a bit here, you have to make a balance between protagonist and antagonist. Now, I don't mean that I'm not saying water is wet when I mean that. What I mean is in a fantasy setting, this is true in most works in general, but it is especially true in a fantasy setting because the relative power level of the antagonist has to be sufficiently strong that only the protagonist can oppose them, and the relative power level of the protagonist has to be sufficiently strong that they can barely defeat the antagonist. And obviously there's some balance issues back and forth here, and it can be done certain different ways. That's not what I'm talking about. Just the general concept starts with that balance point between the two. And sorry, I'm a little out of breath. I just ran out there to get this done as quickly as I could. In Final Fantasy I, the heroes were already heroes. They were already heroes of legend. They were already people who were, the heroes of light. And there was no questioning on that. There was no, who are these people or anything like that. There was no backstory whatsoever given. It was simply always assumed that they were heroes of legend. And that works. In Final Fantasy II, you had children, yes, young adults, young women, or women actually, and men. And they struggled in the face of adversity and managed to persevere based solely on the fact that they didn't give up and believed so strongly in their goal. And they were helped out on many occasions by other individuals who helped basically hold their hand until they were strong enough in order to walk on their own. Final Fantasy III, they decided, again, to go with a different route on that, and the route they took was direct imbuement. This is something that fantasy stories do often. Make the protagonists, oh my goodness, sufficiently powerful in order to make an impact on the plot by granting them that power from an external source that for whatever reason cannot do it on its own. FF7 did this as well, by the way, to use a direct example here for people who are probably more familiar with that game than this one. But in FF3, the crystals, the 4 elemental crystals of light, imbue the children with the ability to change classes, of course, but it is implied and outright stated in several cases, the power that they have, the fact that they can level, the fact that they can face these innumerable dangers is because the crystals have imbued them. There is a second part of that which is almost terrifying when you think of it, which is the thought, which is always lingering in the back of your mind. It's never actually stated outright, that once the danger is done, they go back to being just plain old children, which is, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but that's just a terrifying thought, to go from being someone who can defeat anything in the world to just another kid with some really strange experiences and probably some post-traumatic stress syndrome, if I'm honest. But moving on. Let's get on with that. The point I'm trying to get across here is that the crystals were directly responsible for the imbuement, for the uplifting of them, but they make a point of the fact that these children were not actually destined so much as chosen, if that makes any sense. Those 4 kids happened to fall into that cave and happened to encounter that crystal by more or less sheer happenstance. It was not something that was destined. It was not something that was fated. It happened. They were the first ones around. They managed to get it. Now, I'm going to take a moment here and mention that in the remake this is different, so we'll get to that when we get to the remake section. They actually did change the story a little bit in the remake. But they were basically just random choice. The next kids who came around who happened to come in interaction with the crystal, and once the process started, that's why I say they were chosen. From that point on, they were on the line. They were on the destiny track, if you want to call it like that. And that's an interesting way to approach a style of a story, because it does add a degree of self-believability to it as long as you handle it properly, but it also gets rid of a lot of the need to explain why it is that these 4 people are capable of doing the amazing feats they do, because they are imbued with the power to do so, period, the end. And you don't really question that because there's nothing to question there. It makes sense, especially within a fantasy setting. Later games have some difficulties. I'm not just talking about FFs, but RPGs in general, have some difficulties where individual B can keep up with individual A even though there's no explanation for it. There's no sense making for it other than the fact that they are someone who can also level, aka a player character. I don't like games that do that. I don't like games that don't explain, at least to some degree, why it is that the protagonists have this level of power. Now, I mentioned, I mentioned the antagonist thing as well, and I mentioned that for a very specific reason. Final Fantasy III is also another first in that it had what I like to call the Darth Vader concept. For those of you who are wondering, Darth Vader was effectively the villain of Star Wars, right? The three movies, I mean. Up until the point at which we learn about the Emperor, Emperor Palpatine, at which point it becomes a lot more incredibly obvious that Emperor Palpatine is the actual villain, and he's just been the one behind Darth Vader the whole time. Now, the Final Fantasy series really enjoys this particular concept. Not that I blame them, I actually do too. But FF3 was the first time they pulled that. And, I'm sorry, give me just a second here. Darn it, leave me alone, work. I just want to do my reviews. Is that so wrong? There we go. And so FF3 was basically the first FF to actually pull that off, and did a pretty good job of it, in my opinion. You know, they had the villain who you never actually encounter basically the whole time, to be honest with you. You have the I'm sorry, give me just 1 second. This is aggravating. Update. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. They had a villain who you never actually encounter until you fight him, but he was mentioned often. You learn about his backstory, you learn about his motivations, you learn about some degree about his personality, all before you actually meet him, and you also have the Emperor factor. You know, Emperor Mateus had no characterization and like 2 lines in the whole game, but you learned about who he was as a character thanks to his actions, thanks to the results of his actions, for that matter. And we had the same thing with Zand in Final Fantasy III. You see what he has accomplished, and you see why he has accomplished it that way, and you see how he has descended basically into insanity. And which brings me to another point I'm going to go ahead and make really quick here. Zand is, in my opinion, the first example in the Final Fantasy series of a sympathetic villain, which is another thing the Final Fantasy series loves very much, and indeed most works of art in general do, and for good reason. Again, I like that idea. I like the idea of a sympathetic villain, whether they are actually a villain or not, whether they are an anti-hero, whether they are someone who shouldn't be a villain, you know, whatever the circumstances are. Now, in Zand's case, he was, in fact, a villain, period, the end, evil guy, etc. However, it was possible. It was something that could be understood where his plight was, where his difficulty was, why it is that he snapped, why it is that he did what he did. You know, and I'm not going to spoil it for anybody who doesn't know, although I've already spoiled plenty of these games. I really should just start saying, don't watch these unless you've played it. But Zan's whole mortality thing and the fact that he was granted the gift of death, what that basically, you know, the gift of humanity, the gift of mortality. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I would consider that much of a gift either. And wanting to freeze the world in an unending state of darkness so that he doesn't have to die, not exactly the nicest thing in the world, but it is, like I said, possible to see where he's coming from on that and see why he went down that road. Now, speaking of firsts and villains, like I said, he was the first Stage 1 villain, if you want to call it like that. That's a good term. We'll go ahead and use that. Zand was the Stage 1 villain, and the Cloud of Darkness was the Stage 2 villain, the actual antagonist of the story, which, again, we hear and see so little from, but that was very typical of the older RPGs in general. It was just a problem with everything in the time. The Cloud of Darkness is also interesting because the Cloud of Darkness is the first of the old RPGs, the old Final Fantasies, where she, or it, to be more accurately, or them, to be more accurate, was not completely evil. Oh. Damn it. Emperor Mateus, despite having some level of characterization, despite, you know, obviously being there, was nevertheless pure, unadulterated, no really evil. There was nothing sympathetic, there was no neutrality, there was no shades of gray there whatsoever. Emperor Mateus was evil, the end. Garland / Chaos, obviously even less fleshed out, but again, evil, no really, period, the end. The Cloud of Darkness is, of course, still evil because of the way that they talk, the way they talk about what it is they want, their goals, their means, their aims. But the Cloud of Darkness is also the first example where there was just a little bit of gray involved there, because the Cloud of Darkness ultimately is a byproduct of imbalance, rather than being something that is actively seeking to cause this kind of imbalance, rather than something that is trying to destroy the world. It is something that came into being as a result of the world being out of balance. What in the world? Oh, okay. Sorry, God, I've just got distractions all over the place. And one of the things I really loved, as I was talking earlier about the light versus dark not being good versus evil thing, I really like the fact that the Cloud of Darkness was at one point in time the Cloud of Light. Because, as I mentioned before, the world of darkness once was being overwhelmed by the world of light, and things were out of balance again, and the warriors of dark had to arise to face the threat, blah, blah, blah. And we had the Cloud of Light back then, however many years ago. I believe it was the generic 1 millennia ago. And I found that interesting. I found that fascinating. It really was indicative of the character without having to actually say anything about their backstory whatsoever. And I liked that. So, unfortunately, there really isn't much else I can actually discuss about the Cloud of Darkness / Light. I actually usually refer to him just as the Cloud because of the obvious reasons. But nevertheless, I do think they actually did a great job with that. Also, actually, there's one other thing I want to talk about. The Cloud of Darkness is what most people refer to as the giant space flea from nowhere, because it's not a stark example of it. FF9 would have to take the cake there, but it's an example where you have a whole story, you have a whole setting, and then basically right at the end, or right towards the end, the actual villain shows up and says, "Hey, it's me," and then you have to fight them. The Cloud of Darkness was one of the earlier examples of that, but I still feel it was well done because it made you think after the fact, if you know what I mean. They gave you just enough information in order to infer, and was later confirmed through books and various additional works, remakes, etc., what had happened and why it had happened that way. So it wasn't just a space flea from nowhere. It wasn't unconnected. The Cloud of Darkness wasn't Necron. The Cloud of Darkness was something that was intricately tied into the state of the world, and it could be argued and indeed debated that the Cloud is in fact the actual neutral force of the world between light and the darkness. I don't remember the term for that in yin yang. The actual in between that is trying to maintain, and when you push it one way or another, the reason it becomes evil, the reason it becomes a destructive force, is because it itself is imbalanced just like the world is, and therefore is trying to it's the same thing as a storm. A storm is weather trying to fix itself, basically, to really, really, really simplify it. And that's the same thing that the cloud is, and indeed probably why they referred to it as the Cloud of Darkness way back in the day. And I'm probably reading way too much into this, and I don't care, because I do that. So, moving on. So that's the villain I wanted to discuss there rather quickly. The also thing, as I mentioned, I want to do these sections each time. I hit the villain early. I don't always hit these in the same order, I apologize. But I want to talk about the music of FF3. I got my little list here. In FF3, the Nobuo Uematsu was trying something different. Now, whether it succeeded or not depends on the individual. But rather than simply doing music, he was trying to actually do what most people refer to as movie music, what I usually refer to as scene music. That is to say, rather than doing a song that is indicative of an overworld, for example, or whatever, having a song for a given scene. An FF3 soundtrack was actually quite large, especially for the time. There was a huge amount of music in the game. This is the third thing I mentioned earlier, by the way. There was a lot of music in FF3, and it took up a decent amount of space. But they wanted to do that because Nobuo Uematsu had been pushing for that for this whole time. I don't want to just have a generic town song going on while we have this cutscene playing. I want a song for that cutscene. And he pushed for it, and the people agreed with him on it. And he was allowed to do it, and I agree with that too. I agree that you should have a song that is only played once in a game that you still put that effort in trying to, because that one scene still matters. That one scene still is relevant and it deserves its own music for that scene. Now, obviously, not all scenes in the game are going to be like that. There's practicality and utility to be considered here as well, but I like that ideal, and I like the fact that he pushed for that. And so much of the music in FF3 is hard to listen to just as music, which is one of the reasons I've usually considered it not one of my favorite game soundtracks. However, by in complete contrast of that, what it does do is perfectly highlight the scenes where they are played in the sections in the areas they're played for, and it works beautifully well. FF3 does, of course, have several songs that are on my, I still listen to them now and enjoy them playlist. But leading all up to this, I want to go ahead and mention the last dungeon song, and there's one little tidbit I'll get to. But the last dungeon songs, actually, I really should say, the Eureka thing and the World of Darkness, were really well done. Very tone setting. Actually gave you an impression. Back in FF2 they had the Pandemonium song, which was good and indeed one of my favorite songs. But it was ultimately just a good song. The World of Darkness music, I don't remember the name of the song right now off the top of my head, that played during the World of Darkness segment in Final Fantasy III not only was a good song, but perfectly set the tone of exactly where you are and what the stakes were and how it is. That's what a last dungeon song should do. It should be a continuous feeling of ramping up combined with dread. You should be excited and pumped and dreading, like I just said, and, fretful and fearful and worried and nervous. It should engender these emotions in you, because this is it. In whatever story you're doing, in any story that is worthy of having something called a last dungeon, you should have those feelings. This is it. This is where we're going towards. And FF3 was the first of the FFs that really pulled that off rather well. Not nearly as well as the next one, but I'll get to that later. And so, on top of that, Final Fantasy III, like I said, much more fleshed out soundtrack, and in one extremely important part, I love this. I don't know who actually started this, but it is known that Nobuo Uematsu was a champion of this idea, and I am as well. I've always felt, if I might diverge for just a second, that the last boss of a game deserves above and beyond. It should have... How do I put this? It should have its own custom music, duh. It should have its own graphic styles. It should go above and beyond what it is that the game has done to this point. It should have different feeling, different flair to it, maybe even a different combat style, maybe just using a different engine, maybe having cinematics playing in the background while you're doing it. Something that you haven't done before to emphasize that this is the last boss. They, by virtue of being the last boss, deserve that level of impact. I've always felt that you really need to set the tone and the scene for a last boss, and many games have done that beautifully well. Zelda Twilight Princess is one of my favorite examples of this, because from the moment you fight the possessed Zelda all the way up into the scene where you fight Ganondorf on foot was nothing but one gigantic ramp up of freaking awesome. I could gush about that for hours. That whole sequence from beginning to end was pure poetry. And it got to the end, and then you have this really dark, brooding, brutal, impacting song that literally has a lot of percussion in it to get the point across, as the entire sky is lit up with thunder and lightning, and it is pouring rain, and just... Loved it, right? That's what a last boss should be. Sorry for that divergence. Let's get back to the point. The point is Nobuo Uematsu, at the very least, championed this idea that the last boss deserves special recognition simply by virtue of being the last boss. And this is something they hadn't done before because they didn't have the time, technology, the resources, the anything. But he pushed for it, and he championed this cause, and he said, no, I'm making a last boss song. And so Final Fantasy III has a song called This Is the Last Boss to get the point across. He's always had an interesting sense of humor. And it's not exactly the greatest last boss song ever, but it is worth noting that I can still listen to it to this day and still get the point across. And he had this wonderful build-up. Even in the song, he decided we need a little bit more build-up, and he did so that while the scene is playing, while you're getting ready to fight him, it's just kind of doing its little thing, and then it finally takes off, and I was like, yeah. Just felt like mentioning that because I think that was a crucial element and something that has been so responsible for the reason why so many of the last bosses of the Final Fantasy series have been epic, is because of the music. Now, while we're talking about the last boss here, obviously I've already talked about the Cloud and their impact on the story and whatnot. It is worth noting that the Cloud of Darkness in Final Fantasy III was still a very difficult last boss, one of the most difficult ones still to date, in my opinion. I would say probably the second most difficult of the FF series, in my personal opinion. because she she was still a rough one. They were still a rough one. They still weren't pulling their punches. And while you could certainly become very strong in FF3, four sages or two sages and two ninjas, however you felt like doing that, they knew that, and they knew you could do that, and they decided to go ahead and make that last boss relevant for that concept. And I agree with that decision for reasons that I've already explained. The last boss is special. The last boss deserves that kind of recognition. But that was a difficult fight that was brutal and impacting and really got the point across. It's hard to explain how, looking back on it. But when you were fighting the cloud of darkness, you had a feeling that had never existed before, and that was what, as I just mentioned before, the "this is it" feeling. The understanding of what failure means feeling. You know what I mean? Yes, it's a game, and yes, if you fail, what you have to do is you have to start the last dungeon over and get, from the last save point and blah blah blah. That's not what I'm talking about. The understanding in a lore perspective, in a setting perspective, in an in-character perspective of what defeat would mean if they lost this battle, which gives an additional drive to anyone who actually cares about that story, such as myself, to actually try. And FF3 was the first one to really pull that off, and it's something they've pulled off many times since, but definite kudos for doing that on an NES. At that time and era, it's just mind-boggling that they managed that. My goodness. Now, last thing I want to talk about FF3 is the remake, because this is an interesting point indeed. The Final Fantasy III remake was very well done and very extensive. They took an NES game, dumped it on the DS, and turned it into 3D, and somehow managed to make it awesome. You look at that on paper and it's like, you're not going to pull that off. No, they did. They pulled it off wonderfully. The graphics are not extensive, but they don't have to be, if you know what I mean. I've said this before, FF7 was a little too simple, but if you look at FF4 DS, for example, that's about as far as you need to go with 3D graphics in order for them to still be as expressive and as useful as a storytelling tool that they need to be. Going better is, of course, fine, as long as you're not doing it at the expense of the story for 13. But, I'm sorry, that's unkind. But my point is that you have to meet a certain level of quality in order to... When you make the switch to 3D, you have to make sure you're not doing Mario 64, is really what this statement comes down to. If you are doing a switch to 3D, you have to make sure your graphics are good enough to support that, because it's just like the problem we had with the 2D era. 2D graphics had to evolve to a certain point until we reached the nothing short of stellar 2D graphics that we have to this day, and indeed more slightly less modern but still modern games, such as Zelda Four Swords and the GameCube, was fully 2D graphics, and yet pulled it off amazingly, looked incredible, because we've gone so far with 2D, but 2D used to look terrible. Look at the original Legend of Zelda. By the same token, 3D graphics just weren't that good back in the day. So when Final Fantasy VII was out, one of my biggest complaints about that game, to my regret, is the graphics. I'll go into that more when I get there. But it looked like they'd made the switch to 3D too early, in my opinion, is really what I'm getting across here. By contrast, FF9 did that same super deformed thing, and yet somehow managed to pull it off basically perfectly for the 3D, and so forth and so on. Point is, the FF3 DS remake took 3D, made it good, made it look awesome, managed to get expressions and emotions across. They had the thing where the characters actually were able to emote, and I'm not just talking about what they're saying. They actually had, the slouching or they had motion, they had emotion, and they got it across. Very, very well done, and which is an excellent storytelling tool. And one of the limits of working with 2D is you have a sprite which has only so many poses you can put it in. So that worked out really well. They redid all the music, of course, and they did a fantastic job on it. There were a lot of really, really good songs in the FF3 DS remake. One of the other things they did was they added to and expanded the story. I mentioned earlier that FF3, you were just kind of chosen by random. You were the first ones to happen along. In FF3 DS, you were again destined. It was designed from the beginning, because in FF3 DS, I'm sorry, I actually missed this earlier. I mentioned back in FF1 that there were only two games, technically one, that had non-characters as the player characters. That would be FF1 and FF3. In FF3 you play 4 youths, in FF1 you play 4 heroes. That's it. No background, no personality, no setting, nothing. FF3 DS flung all that out the window. You actually are playing specific characters. Lunith and I don't remember any of the other ones' names, to be honest with you, but all four of them have names, backstories, personalities, lines, characterization, that sort of thing. And so, of course, obviously they expanded upon that significantly because there are all of a sudden scenes where the characters were talking, which didn't exist in the original FF3. On top of that, of course, is the fact that they had when I say relationships, I mean interactions, societal interactions, not just with each other, but with various NPCs. And like I said, they were destined because all four of them were originally from the world. And what happened, and we're given bits and pieces of this. I like it when they do this, when they don't state it outright. This is the airship that Sid was on, right? And they were flying, literally trying to escape the sealing of the world in darkness. Failed, got sealed with it, and what happened is the airship just kind of drifted for what is literally an undeterminate period of time, because we have no idea how long the world has been sealed in darkness, but we know it's been a while. And so it literally could have been decades that they were drifting, frozen in time, until the airship finally managed to literally hit the floating continent, by sheer luck or fate, depending on how you define it. And in so doing, managed to finally unfreeze themselves, but have obviously have no idea where they are, what they're doing, and all that, and dispersed amongst the floating continent. And of course, they added the fact that Sid was the one who built that airship, who was also from the rest of the world, from the below world, if you want to call it that, so forth and so on. They really added to the backstory of the floating continent itself and why it was there. They talked more about Zand and his motivations and whatnot. They talked about the cloud, and again, the cloud of light and the cloud of darkness was mentioned. The dark warriors received more mentions. They really just, in short, fleshed out the story considerably in basically every way. So while it still has that same problem I mentioned earlier with FF3 story, because they didn't change the story except for a couple points, it nonetheless feels sufficiently fleshed out that the game improved, in my impression, considerably across the board. They also did couple other things. Obviously, there were some basic balance changes. They changed the way a lot of the classes worked because it's later and they are much more experienced at actually balancing such things now. So the Sage and the Ninja are not the unholy Doom classes of Doom that they were back in the original. But one of the things I'm talking about specifically is the mindset. Now, I'm going to mention this here because this is actually the FF3 DS remake is the first time in this series of me doing this that this philosophy started, even though it actually started in the next game, Final Fantasy IV. That philosophy is the concept that while the last boss should be some kind of degree of difficult, it is worth noting that there are many people playing this game who do not have the skill or time, or both, to defeat truly difficult enemies like that. And I don't mean that as a bad thing. I want to stress that time one again, too, because that's an important one, too. Lord knows I have time problems out the wazoo right now. I have actually kind of forced my schedule to sit and wait, and I'm going to probably end up paying for that in order to do these reviews, for example, because it's important to me, blah, blah, blah. But that's not the point. My point is time is an issue. So if you're going to make a boss that requires me to be level Begrillion with all this stuff that I have to spend time in order to invest in order to get, you see the problem here. And so what started happening, and has happened continuously more so all the way up till 13, which is the first game I've seen in the series to break this trend, is if you could imagine the difficulty curve here, with this being the last boss and this being the beginning, it usually, in the old games, it did this, from FF3DS and FF4 more properly and on, it actually did more like this. Now what has been happening all the way up till FF13 is this line has been straightening out and straightening out and straightening out, and in some cases actually going down a bit, which is kind of silly when you think about it, but FF8, I'm looking at you. But they did that because they wanted the people who played this game, any people who played this game, to still be capable of enjoying the whole story and the experience, and I am actually fully in favor of that. And one of the main reasons I'm in favor of that is because they said, hold up, we still have a lot of people who want this to be challenging, who enjoy the challenge, who want to have a difficult fight. And and I am one of those people, I admit it freely. I thought every time, I'll get to that later, I think that there should be some level of challenge to the game, and so they came up with what I nowadays have referred to as, for many years, as the super optional. Optional bosses was not exactly a new concept. In fact, there are examples of that going quite a ways back. Optional bosses are exactly what they sound like. A super optional is exactly what is basically exactly what it sounds like. It is the most difficult boss or bosses in the game. Usually when I refer to the super optional, I'm referring to the most difficult boss of any given game, because several games have multiple difficult optionals. You know, for example, in my opinion, in FF7 it would be Ruby Weapon. In FF5 it would be Shinryu. I'm sorry, no, it would be. Depending on what version you're playing would determine which one it was in FF5. So let's just ignore that as an example. In the original FF5, it would be Omega Weapon. In FF8, it would be the Omega Weapon. That's a bad example. Whatever. In FF10, it would be Nemesis, you know, blah, blah, blah. The super optional was invented as a concept so that the people who wanted the challenge could still have it, whereas everyone else could still actually beat the game. And I do agree with that as a concept, again, in moderation. As I said, it got a little stupid towards the end there, where the game was just so easy that it was kind of insulting. And in many cases, even the super optional was just kind of like, uh-huh. But moving on. The reason I mention this is because FF3DS added a super optional, the Iron Giant. Now, the Iron Giant, you kind of can't get around this for a game like FF3 because there's only so much customization. Ultimately, all you can do is decide your class. You can't get benefits from other classes. You can't do anything else, give yourself custom abilities. All you can do is decide on a class that works for you and stick with it. So they could only make this, they couldn't make it a trick boss, they couldn't make it a complicated boss, or a WoW boss is actually what I refer to that term nowadays. It's also sometimes referred to as a Zelda boss. The point being, they couldn't do that. All they could do is make a boss that hit hard, that had a lot of health, that had a lot of armor. And that's what they did. That's exactly what the Iron Giant is. It is the classic example of a super optional. He hits like a truck, he hits often, he has a lot of HP, he has a lot of armor. So you have to level up to go beat him. Now, I did beat him when I played through the FF3DS. That was this year, wasn't it, when I finally finished that? And I'd put it aside because I'd lost 20 hours of game time through my own flagrant stupidity. On this boss, actually. What had happened is I'd been leveling and using the temporary save slot rather than the regular save slot, and was going to the next town where I was at in the plot to save. By sheer happenstance, saw this rock outcropping in the water and decided to land there, and was like, huh, there's a cave here. And that was the super optional boss in that cave. No way of avoiding the fight once I got in. I didn't know that. I got creamed. And I lost 20 hours of leveling time, of raw grinding, and I lost the will to play it for a year. So anyways, that's not a thing against the game, I just was explaining. And I know that's a lot to say about something as incredibly simple of a concept as super optional, but I felt it was worthy of discussion, because I do agree with that as a conceptual level. I do agree with that within moderation, and I do, if I was making a game, I would probably do a difficulty curve. I would use the FF4 difficulty curve, which is still curved like this, but it's actually not as much. It's more like this. You know, it's more or less flat until you get about here, and then it starts to arc up. And then, you know, optionals, and then super optional. That's how I'd do it. And I guess I'm actually out of things to talk about with FF3. So, I'm going to give my throat a rest. I brought in some lozenges so I can get started on my next one here, and try and knock out my next review. So I will be talking to you guys shortly.